There we go. Okay, so we'll start things off with just a brief introduction on Zyxel. It's a single slide here. A little bit about us for any of you that might be new and haven't sat through one of my PowerPoints before. So Zyxel's been around since 1989 making computer networking equipment. So we've been doing this for quite a while, even if to you we might be a new name. Out in the field, we have over 100 million devices deployed. We've got a little over 1,500 employees out there, and we're currently selling our products in 150 different global markets. So on to today's webinar, Wireless 101. We'll start with some of the basics here when it comes to Wi-Fi. So to begin with, there's 3 different players out there whose names you're going to see a lot: IEEE, the Wi-Fi Alliance, and the FCC. So the FCC is the government. They're the ones who set rules about what frequencies can be used, power output, overlap, things like that. So in order for us to import the product in, it needs to comply with those FCC rules. Although, to be honest, the FCC doesn't always do a particularly good job of enforcing the rules. A few years back, Netgear, for instance, had to sue, I believe it was ASUS, because ASUS was selling product that was exceeding FCC requirements, which is how they were winning their performance reviews. But anyway, that's who we follow. We do a pretty good job of sticking with the FCC and making sure we're in compliant with our equipment. The Wi-Fi Alliance is an industry group, a bunch of different manufacturers. Their main job is to certify product compatibility or interoperability, but also for marketing. So they're the ones behind the Wi-Fi certified logo. They're the ones who are behind renaming all the different Wi-Fi technologies, Wi-Fi 4, Wi-Fi 5, Wi-Fi 6, from instead of being 802.11n, AC, and AX. And then there's IEEE. It's a big group of engineers, a lot of them working with the chipset vendors. They try to create the standards that we come from. So when you see something advertised as 11B or 11AC, that's a reference to the IEEE standard that we follow. So Wi-Fi works using radio waves, same things that you find in your walkie-talkies, AM, FM radio, TV, same sort of thing. Basically, as frequency goes up, more data can be put on, can be crammed into the same amount of bandwidth, but also as the frequency goes up, the range drops off. So the story I like to tell here is for you, those of you that are older like myself, in the early days of cordless phones, they were based on 900 megahertz technology, and you could get on that phone and you could walk outside and walk down the block and maintain a phone conversation. Starting in the late 80s, early 90s, we saw a move from cordless phones from 900 megahertz to 2.4. So the problem with 900 megahertz is the sound quality wasn't necessarily all that great, and there wasn't enough frequency available, so you'd run into issues with interference between you and your neighbors, especially with the long range. So at 2.4, higher frequency than 900, it allowed the sound quality to increase. It unlocked some new channels so that there's less crowding. But the downside was maybe you were lucky if your phone worked out in your yard. You can no longer walk down the block. And then in the mid-90s, he started pushing 5 gigahertz phones. So the number of channels available went up, sound quality went up, and because he had the extra bandwidth, he increased the level of security, so you didn't have to worry about people listening in on your calls. But now, if you have a big house, you might have problems using your cordless phone in different rooms. You might need repeaters. So it's the same thing with Wi-Fi. We're using those exact same channels that cordless home phones can use. And we have the same sort of issues that we run across here. Most frequencies that are out there require an FCC license to be able to use them. So there's only a small amount of frequency that's available for anybody to use without a license. So it's the 900 megahertz band. You can see here from 902 to 928 megahertz, 2.4 gigahertz range, and the 5 gigahertz range. So when we're looking at power on our access points, most consumer products you will see advertised as milliwatts. So it's really common when you go out there to see like 200 milliwatt, 500 milliwatt, something like that is the advertised power. On business class products, you tend to see dBm being used instead. So the reason we use dBm in part is because it's really easy to do calculations when you're calculating the distance and range. So all the formulas in mathematics, when you're calculating things, are done using dBm. And dBm is really easy to use to calculate total output power of both the chip itself and the antenna. So you can simply take the, a 20 dB radio, and you can add a 8 dBi antenna gain to it, and you can essentially add those together and get 28 dBm total output power. So it's really easy to use. So as we notice here, when dBm goes up, for every 3 dB, you're doubling your milliwatt output power. And so this causes a lot of confusion for folks, because they'll go, well, I went from a 100 milliwatt router at home to a 200 milliwatt router, so I should double my range. And the answer is no. There's a complicated formula for determining how quickly the signal drops off, but in general, you're not going to see double range for double power. It's much closer to what you would see using dBm, although even that's still not quite accurate. Some other things to know is signal-to-noise ratio. This is probably the most important yet overlooked aspect of dealing with Wi-Fi. So this is basically the strength of the signal as you can hear it versus the level of noise around you. So think of this as like trying to hold a conversation with someone. If you're in an empty conference room, you can talk at normal levels, you can hear each other. But if you go out to a crowded bar, you might have to raise your voice to be able to hear each other or get closer together. So that other noise in the bar is the noise, what we're looking at here from the signal-to-noise ratio, whereas the signal is how loud you're talking to each other. Go out to a nightclub or something like that, it may not be possible to hold a conversation, or you're shouting into each other's ears because the noise ratio is so high compared to how loud the signal is, essentially. And then the other term that you'll see used a lot is attenuation. It's basically telling you how much the signal degrades. So up at the top of the screen here, this is our fun little formula. So this is free space path loss in dB. Simply take 20 log 10 of your distance, and that, is that right? Distance? Yeah, distance, and then 20 log 10 over your frequency. So you can see here 5 gigahertz versus 2.4. You would plug that in there, add 92.45, and that'll tell you how far your signal can go, assuming there's no noise and there's no other obstructions. So it's a little bit complicated for people. If you really need to calculate it, such as doing outdoor links, trying to connect buildings together outdoors, there are free calculators on the web that you can use. You can punch in some stuff, and it'll help tell you how far you can expect that signal to go. And then the table down here at the bottom, this is just showing you, some common loss. So you'll see here a standard glass window will get you a 3 dB of loss. So again, if you're looking at milliwatts, that halves your milliwatt output power. If you're looking at a tinted window, it's got metal on it. If you block heat, block UV, block infrared, you can triple the loss from 3 all the way up to almost 8. Wade is asking a question here. Let me go ahead and answer it. The question is, will the slideshow be available later? Sure. So this is recorded. So you can always find this on our YouTube page if you want to watch the webinar. If you want a copy of these slides, just reach out to your salesperson, and they can get you a copy of this in PDF format for you. So anyway, back to this, just showing you, how big of a difference a little bit of metal makes on there. As you go there, it makes a lot of sense. As the walls get thicker, you get more and more loss. Floors, same thing, get a lot of loss there. So anyway, another thing we want to talk about is RF behavior. So RF travels in essentially straight lines at first, but you can see here, you get an obstruction, you're going to attenuate the signal, but the signal also radiates out and can bounce off of things. When it bounces off of things, it can scatter, weakening the signal and sending it out in different directions. A good way to think about this is ripples in a pond. You've got a pond someplace, you've got a little dock that lets you walk out there, you chuck rocks in there, and you can watch how the ripples radiate out from the source, so that would be your access point. And you can see as they hit walls, you can see them bounce off of walls. If you've got little pegs, holding up the dock, you can watch the waves sort of wrap around. Same stuff is being done with Wi-Fi. So when we're talking about Wi-Fi range in a typical office environment or home environment, something you need to keep in mind is that Wi-Fi is two-way communication. So even if you're streaming something like Netflix, where most of the signal is coming downstream to the client device, the client device still has to report back, hey, yeah, I received those packets, they're fine, or let you know, no, wait a minute, I didn't get those packets, I got some packets out of order, can you resend me those missing packets? So in order to maintain that connection, both sides have to be able to hear each other. So one of the problems we run into is your access point is, these days, at least 500 milliwatts, often more once you add in the antenna gain. But your little client device is really weak. An iPhone is, I think, somewhere in the neighborhood of 25 milliwatts versus 500 milliwatts over here. So you can see there's a huge disparity in the signal strength and how far those signals can go. So that's why you'll often run into this situation. I'm sure we've all encountered this. Your phone shows you've got a solid 3 or 4 bars of Wi-Fi signal, and yet you can't get your Wi-Fi to work. And that's simply because your phone is reporting how strong the signal is coming from the AP. It has no way to know how strong the signal is back here at the AP and whether the AP can hear it. So what happens is your phone sees a nice strong signal, but your AP can't hear any of the handshaking communication that needs to come back. So that's why your signal is very poor, or the connection's very weak. So another interesting thing here is when you're talking about radio frequencies, we have an exception we'll talk about later. But with most stuff from 802.11, the beginnings all the way up to 11AC, essentially only one device can transmit at a time. So if you've ever used walkie-talkies as a kid, especially those old analog ones, if 2 people talked at the same time, it turns into a garbled mess. It's the exact same thing with Wi-Fi. So everybody takes turns transmitting. Access point transmits, a client over here transmits, access point transmits again to somebody else, et cetera, et cetera. So when they created Wi-Fi, way back in, what was it, the late 90s, I believe it was, with the original 802.11 spec, they didn't expect to see a lot of continuous transmission. People weren't using data to send a lot of big files. There weren't a lot of users. So instead of doing some sort of management protocol, which would use extra CPU overhead, would eat up batteries faster, we just went with this simple little flow chart here. Basically, hey, I need to transmit something. Yes, I do. So I'll go down here, and I'll listen to see if anybody else is transmitting. Is nobody transmitting? If somebody is transmitting, you go up here and you use a random number generator to determine how long you should wait before going back through the flow chart. If you listen and no one is broadcasting, then you get permission to go ahead and send the information you want. Unfortunately, if someone else also listens at the same time and decides, hey, I need to send something, you end up with a collision where your packets get dropped, and you have to end up retransmitting that. So one of the problems you run into here is you'll have your access point in a central location, and you'll have a client to one side of the access point and another client on the other side of the access point. The AP and the client device can hear each other just fine. Same circle over here, but they can't hear each other. So when they check to listen to see if somebody else transmitting, they won't be able to hear the guy on the other side. They will assume that no one's using the radio and will decide to start transmitting. So now this guy, your AP in the middle, is now hearing data from this side and this side at the same time. So it turns into a garbled mess and your connection degrades. So this is a very big problem when it comes to access points, because a lot of times what happens is people go, well, how many clients can I have on your AP? And the short answer is, regardless of what's on the data sheet, whether it's 128, whether it's 256, whether it's 512, you're going to start running into problems with guys talking over each other, both due to the hidden node problem and just due to multiple devices wanting to transmit at the same time and both deciding at the same time that no one else is. So you run into this a lot, where depending on what you're doing, or regardless of what you're doing, you're generally going to run out of, you're going to start having performance degradation well before you get anywhere close to that data sheet number for the maximum number of clients. And this is being determined not by the access point, it's being determined by the Wi-Fi protocol and how it works. Basically, once you start getting too many active users on there, you're going to start stepping on each other's toes no matter what. So you're generally going to start running into performance issues long before you get to the maximum number of clients it shows on the data sheet. And how many you can fit on there. Now, I've got a slide coming up where I go into this a little bit more. But it depends a lot on what type of clients you have connected and what sort of things they're doing on the network. But in general, you're never going to want more than around 24 to 32 users on a network on an access point at the same time, or on the same radio on an access point at the same time. Okay, so another thing I want to talk about here is data rate versus throughput. These are often used interchangeably. They may be used differently than how I use them here. But just in general, the way this is generally done is data rate is what you will see advertised on particularly consumer equipment, right? You'll see AC 1750, AC 2600, N300, etc. So what that is that's the data rate. Also, you can use it interchangeably with the physical rate or the link rate. So basically, that's telling you how much data is being sent from one device to the other device on the Wi-Fi network. And that includes, and this is really important, all of the protocol overhead that goes into making Wi-Fi work. Now, this way of naming speeds based on the data rate or the physical rate dates back to the early days of Ethernet. The difference, though, is with Ethernet, there's very little protocol overhead. Your actual data you can send over that link that you want to send is almost very similar to the physical rate, not so much with Wi-Fi. So the other number you'll see out there is throughput. So throughput is, what you would measure if you went out to speedtest.net or something like that and did a speed test. And what you're going to find is generally your throughput number is going to be significantly less than the advertised data rate. So first thing is, are you even connected? What data rate are you connected at? Are you close enough? Is your signal strength quality good enough that you've got the data rate you expect, such as, let's say, on an AC 1750 product, 1750? Are you even getting that data rate? And then once you figure out what data rate you're at, you probably need to take off around 60% for protocol overhead with Wi-Fi to get the actual throughput that you're going to measure on speedtest.net. So you can see here, with Ethernet, there's very little overhead, where with Wi-Fi, there's tons and tons of overhead that goes into allowing Wi-Fi to work over radio waves that have to be shared with every other device that wants to use that unlicensed spectrum. So to make Wi-Fi work as good as it does, you're actually transmitting a lot more data between your client device and the access point or vice versa than you realize, because that's additional data that's tacked on top of the, say, the file you want to upload or the video information you want to stream. Hope that makes sense. So now we get into the question, well, how do you increase speed? So I'm coming at this from a technology point of view, so from a chipset or hardware vendor point of view. So the ways you can do it is you can increase QAM. QAM is the encoding, how we're cramming that information onto that radio signal. So with 11N, it was 64 QAM. With 11AC, you had the options to go up to 256 QAM. And now with 802.11ax, you go up to 1,024 QAM. So a question I hear every now and then was, well, why didn't we just start down here? And the answer is, it takes a lot of horsepower to be able to do this encoding. And the older technology and the older chips just didn't have the horsepower to be able to do this higher level of encoding. And that's really important on Wi-Fi, especially because you've got mobile devices, right? Your laptop, your phone, your tablet, where you've got a finite amount of battery power. So you want to make sure you've got hardware available that can handle the processing required to do these higher levels of QAM without even using up a lot of power. And it's just taking a lot of time for chipsets to get efficient enough and powerful enough to be able to handle this. The other thing you can do is increase your spatial streams, and we've got some slides on that. And then just increasing your bandwidth available, right? So 11G was 20 megahertz, 11N allowed you to use up to 40 megahertz of bandwidth. 11AC let you use 80 megahertz of bandwidth, and it jumped all the way up to 160 megahertz of bandwidth with some of the Wave 2 products. So again, we'll go through a little bit more here on the slides and talk about this. So when talking about bandwidth to increase your speeds using wider and wider bits of bandwidth, it's important to remember how many channels are actually available. So when you pull up your interface and you go to the channel selection screen, you will see here in the United States that there's 11 channels available for you to use in the 2.4 gigahertz spectrum. The problem is In Wi-Fi, right, we're using 20 megahertz channels. So each of these channels aren't spaced out that you see spaced out by 20 megahertz. So if you actually look at the bandwidth being used with 11B and 11G, you're using 20 megahertz channels. There's only 3 available before the channels overlap and you start causing interference. So really important if in an office with multiple APs, in a an apartment or condo situation where you've got a lot of neighbors, you can see how quickly you're going to run out of space. And then keep in mind with 802.11n, we added the ability to use a 40 megahertz channel. So if you're using a 40 megahertz channel, you're pretty much stuck just using this middle portion with a little bit hanging off here on either side. If you try to use 2 40 megahertz channels, they'll overlap and cause interference. So again, if you're in an office or a condo or an apartment where you've got a lot of APs in the vicinity, essentially as soon as you have a second device, you're starting to have to deal with interference between multiple APs. So that's why there was a big push to 5 gigahertz. You can see here there's a lot more channels available in the 5 gigahertz space. So these are your 20 megahertz channels. I think there's something like 25 or 26 of them here that you, in theory, can use. But you'll notice here in the middle, we have something here called DFS channels. We went from channel 52 to 144. So what are those? So basically, when the FCC opened up the 5 gigahertz spectrum, there was already somebody using this, specifically radar devices. Whether we're talking radar weather, airport weather, military radar, they're using this stuff. So what the FCC came by and said is, hey, great, you can use these channels as long as there's no radar using these channels. So what happens is that AP, to use these channels, has to wait a minute when it tries to use them to listen to make sure there's no radar being used in the same frequency. Once it's determined that, then it can start using that frequency. But as soon as radar kicks in again, you have to turn off that channel. So the AP then has to jump to another channel. And again, if it's a DFS channel, it has to wait about, I think it's 30 seconds or a minute, listening before it can start broadcasting to verify that channel is not in use. And then another thing here is a lot of consumer equipment, a lot of your, bring your own device stuff doesn't actually support these DFS channels. And the reason for that is really simple. It takes 6 months approximately after regular FCC certification to get your DFS certification. So if you want to sell the latest, greatest product out on the market, you have a choice. You either sell it without DFS support, or you let your competitors get a 6-month jump, and then you launch yours once you've got the DFS support. Or alternately, you have to do a firmware update to allow the device to be upgraded to support DFS. Which can cause confusion, especially on the consumer side of things where no one knows what DFS is. So because of that, a lot of businesses choose not to use these DFS channels. I guarantee you when someone calls us and says, hey, your AP keeps losing connectivity, 85% of the time when we look into it, we find they're using one of these DFS channels. So we've either got weather or radar over here that's using these channels, they're on one of these channels, or they're over here and there's a military or airport nearby that occasionally will broadcast radar on these channels, or maybe a university doing something or other. And so that happens. Same thing, we get a lot of people saying, hey, we've got this, your network, it's working great, but Bob can't use his tablet on the network. Or, Jill can't use her new whatever phone she just bought. There's something wrong with your equipment, it's not compatible, and the answer tends to be, again, you're using one of these DFS channels, and that particular device doesn't support using these channels. So for that reason, a lot of people just end up sticking with this section here and this section here. So instead of having all, 25 channels or whatever this is, you end up with, what is that, 9, 10 channels. So you significantly cut the amount of channels that are available. And again, we were talking about here, we increase bandwidth to increase our data rate, or the throughput. So if we go up to 40 megahertz channels, which has pretty much been the standard for the last few years, you see you dramatically reduce it. Now you've only got 4 channels in this green area that don't overlap with each other, that you can use without causing interference, without jumping to these DFS channels. And with 11AC and now Wi-Fi 6, we've now got these 80 megahertz channels, and you see here now you've only got 2 channels that you can use without causing interference. So again, if you're in an office building, if you're doing a warehouse, if you're doing condos or apartments, you start getting interference really quick if you've got more than 2 access points around that are set to use 180 megahertz channels. And then if you go up to 160 gigahertz, or megahertz, excuse me, you have to use DFS channels. There's just no other way to do it. But again, you've only got 2 available. So now we'll jump on to spatial streams. So you might remember that slide earlier where I was talking about RF. So RF can travel in a straight line. It can bounce off of stuff. It can reflect. So that was something that we call multipath, right? This data, the signal that you're sending out can take these different paths. And you'll notice the straight path is, for obvious reasons, shorter than a reflected path. So what that means is the signal here reaches this device before the signal from here, and before the signal from here, which is the last one. So now you've sent the data once, but this device is hearing it 3 or 4 different times, essentially like talking in a really in an echoey environment, maybe like a bathroom, like a gym showers where everything's tile and you get the echo. So this was a nightmare in the original days of 802.11b and G. Other things with these, reflections is they can merge back together, they can boost the signal, they can cancel the signal. So some smart engineers, a few of them at Zyxel subsidiary Zydas, which eventually got bought out by Atheros, realized you could take advantage of these multiple paths and allow you to send different data. So now what happens is you've got 2 antennas here. You send, both are using the same frequency, but you send out one stream of data off of one antenna and a separate different stream of data off the other antenna. Each signal comes in slightly timed out differently, and with the magic that the engineers were able to do, your device is able to recognize those different signals and separate them out because of the different timing that they achieve. So instead of being able to send 150 meg stream to your client device, you can now send these different spatial streams, in this case 2, to get a 300 megabits of data sent at the same time. If you had a third antenna transmitting, you could get up to 450 megabits of data being transmitted at the same time. So this is what we call MIMO, multiple in, multiple out. So we're able to send multiple streams out, and hopefully your client device can listen to multiple streams coming in. Then with 802.11ac Wave 2, they added something called MIMO. It only worked downstream, but it allows your access point to use these same spatial streams. So instead of sending 300 megabits to one device, you can now send a 150 megabit stream of data to one device and a different 150 megabit stream to a different device, allowing your access point to transmit data to multiple devices at the same time. So again, it's only available from the access point to the clients with 802.11ac. Wi-Fi 6 now allows client devices to then use MIMO to send data back upstream to the access point. So multiple client devices can now transmit at the same time without interfering with each other. So when you're looking at, particularly in business class APs, you will often see when talking about speeds or the antenna behaviors, it'll be denoted as 2x2, 3x3, 2x3, etc. So basically this first number that you see is telling you how many spatial streams your device can transmit, and the second number is how many spatial streams the device can receive. So particularly on mobile devices, you'll often see like 2x3. The mobile device can receive 3 spatial streams of data at a time, but when it talks back to the access point, it can only transmit 2. When you look particularly at Cisco equipment, you'll see 4x4, and then you'll see a colon and a second number after that. So that's a little bit weird, and it's something that is done here. So basically you've got 4 different antennas that can be used for spatial streams, 4 transmit, 4 receive, but the chip itself only supports 3. So essentially a 4x4 3 is effectively the same as a 3x3 with no colon number after it. You can make some arguments that because you've got the flexibility of which which of those 4 antennas you're going to use. You can use up to 3 at a time. You can switch which 3 you're using. It may give you a little bit better coverage, may allow you to get a little bit better signal-to-noise ratio than a true 3x3. Real world, I don't think it makes any difference. So putting it all together, we've got a nice chart here. I expect you to memorize in the next 10 seconds before I move on to the next slide. But it's basically showing you how you combine these things, the number of spatial streams, the level of QAM you're using, and your bandwidth. Add them all together, and it tells you how much data you're going to be able to get. So an 11AC device with 256 QAM, 1 spatial stream, 80 megahertz channel, is a 433 megabit device. Double the spatial stream, leave everything else the same, and now you get up to 866.7. So these are probably speeds you're used to seeing on data sheets and whatnot for the 5 gigahertz radio on 11AC devices. So that's how we get to them. So you can see if for some reason, go back here to 1 spatial stream, if for some reason your device cannot maintain the 256 QAM, you drop down to 64 QAM, you see your speed drops from 433 to 325. If you're crowded and you can't use an 80 megahertz channel, you drop here from 433 to only 200 megabit throughput by going from 80 to 40. So I already talked about this briefly. How many devices can I get on one access point? What number is on the data sheet is meaningless. It comes down to the density and type of devices, what sort of applications you're using. For instance, VoIP, right? VoIP only needs what? 64 kilobits per second. I mean, it's really, really non-intensive when it comes to bandwidth. But it's one of the trickier things to do over Wi-Fi, simply because Wi-Fi is being used over radio, where you're expected to have interference, you're expected to have drop packets, you're expected to need to retransmit every now and then. And because voice communication is real time, there's no buffering that can be done like with a Netflix stream. Right, so a Netflix stream sends a ton of data, but your client device that's viewing that stream buffers a few seconds of data. So when packets come in out of order or get dropped, there's plenty of time for those packets to be retransmitted and then added into the buffer, so when it gets time to play it, it's there. You can't do that with voice. So voice, even though it's not using much bandwidth, is really, really picky about interference, delayed packet transmits, things like that, which won't affect web browsing, won't affect streaming, won't really affect file transfers. So if you're doing voice over Wi-Fi, you need a really pristine environment to have it work really well. Or you need to have your QoS, you need to have your APs really dialed in for that to work. Whereas if you're just, using it to stream video or check email, it doesn't need to be that it's not that picky. So all of this combines to let you know how many devices you can get on the network before you start running into issues. So just to do a little simulation here, this is a simulation. We're taking the same thing. Client device is viewing a 3 megabit stream. Could be video, could be FTP transfer, doesn't matter. We're giving the client's signal strength of negative 67 dBm, 5 gigahertz, 20 megahertz channel. So if your client devices have 3 spatial streams, you can get 100 megabits of throughput, which equals 34 client devices, each using a 3 megabit data stream. If we change it and only have 2 spatial streams instead of 3 spatial streams, you'll notice your aggregated bandwidth is only 65 megabits. We've lost 35 megabits of data, right? Because we're only using 2 spatial streams instead of 3 spatial streams. So we're essentially a thirding the aggregated bandwidth that's available. So now we can only fit 21 client devices on the network. Drop to a single spatial stream client device, and now your throughput's all the way down to an aggregated 30 megabits for only 10 devices being able to be connected. So again, the access point didn't change, signal strength didn't change, Wi-Fi standard didn't change. The only thing that changed is how many spatial streams each client device could use. And it means the difference between 34 devices being able to have a 3 megabit stream with no quality issues, dropping all the way down to just 10. So you can see just that one factor. Then throw in the fact some devices can only support G, some devices are 811N, some devices are 11AC, Some devices have really fast data rate because they're close to the AP, where other devices are at a really low data rate, and you can see it becomes really complex really fast how many devices you can fit on that access point. And again, this limitation has nothing to do with the AP hardware. It's all about the way Wi-Fi itself works, the protocol, the handshaking, and the airtime utilization. So now we're going to talk a little bit about co-channel interference and a little bit more in depth. So I've mentioned before, only one device can transmit at a time. They all have to take turns. The problem that you run into is, in most environments, you've got multiple access points. So some of those access points are going to be using the same channels as other access points. The other problem you've got is you're using this 2.4 or 5 gigahertz spectrum. It's unlicensed spectrum. So anything that's wireless, whether it's Wi-Fi or not, is probably using these channels. Bluetooth is using these channels. The game controller for your console is using these channels. Your wireless keyboard is using these frequencies. So you've got to deal with interference from that. Microwaves put out 2.4 gigahertz interference, a lot of it. Industrial equipment like air conditioners, they can put out a ton of 5 gigahertz or 2 gigahertz devices. So all of these are putting out RF and they're causing interference. They're raising that noise floor or they're directly canceling out data that's being sent. We got a question real quick. Let me go ahead and answer the question. So networks would appear to be slower if the majority of clients were smartphones, right? So in that situation, just looking at the spatial streams, doesn't matter what the device is. We were just looking at the spatial streams, and in general, a phone supports less spatial streams than a brand new laptop does. So that's where that was coming into it. But yeah, it's all about, I'm just going through all those different factors that can affect how fast your network seems and how many devices you can have on the network before you start running into interference. So this here, talking about co-channel interference, this is a big part of also what's going on your network. So generally the way you dealt with co-channel interference, right, you guys, those of you who have been doing this for a while probably remember this. You map out, here's this AP, here's this AP, you put them on a floor plan, and then you try to jump between, those 3 non-overlapping channels you had in 2.4 or the 9 or 10 or whatever it is in 5 gigahertz to try to make sure they're not interfering with each other. And then what you would do is you would lower the signal strength on your access points. So the APs aren't overlapping each other here in the middle anymore, which is great. It reduces co-channel interference. The problem is it's also reducing the signal strength coming out of your access points for your clients that are out here. So while there's less interference, the signal-to-noise ratio has just gotten worse, so the data rate has probably gotten down. So oftentimes it was a wash. You could have poor connectivity due to co-channel interference, or you can have poor connectivity just due to low signal strength. Kind of washed out. So when we're looking at antennas, the vast majority of your access points, these little charts here showing the coverage area of an access point here in the middle. So your traditional, ceiling mount access point sends out this sort of circular antenna pattern. If we look at it from the other axis, it would look kind of like an umbrella, right? It would look sort of like that. If you have a directional antenna, primarily being used outdoors to do point-to-point links, you can see it focuses the antenna and the signal beam in a direction. So smart antenna combines those two together in a really interesting way. So with smart antenna, the access point, instead of just having one antenna pattern, instead of just having a circular pattern or just having a directional pattern, we actually have hundreds of different patterns that the access point can choose to use. So our algorithm looks at where the client device is in relation to the access point and tries to focus the signal as much as possible on where that client is. But it also takes a look at where other sources of RF interference are. And again, chooses an antenna pattern which ignores where the interference is. It does this in real time. It doesn't require anything special on the client device. And unlike beamforming, it doesn't matter if the device moves. We can move and change the antenna pattern in real time as the clients move around. It makes a huge difference in crowded environments like a conference room, a convention center, a classroom, or like a hotel or office building where you've got lots and lots of other devices around that you don't manage, that you don't control, that might be causing interference. So to try to illustrate this in a way that makes sense, we took a look at this here. So this is your modern day way of doing hotels. We're getting away from adding an AP in the hall and trying to cover a bunch of rooms in a circle. We're moving to one AP per room, or one AP per every other room. So that's what we've simulated here. We've got a bunch of different rooms. You can see we make sure that there's no adjacent APs using the same channel. So 100 here, none of these guys are interfering. There's a decent distance between them. You'd be surprised at just how far access points have to be apart before they don't cause interference with each other on the same channel. So anyway, in this test, we took our NWA 1302, which has smart antenna, and we took a Ubiquiti UAP ACIW, their equivalent model. Spec-wise, very similar. And you can see with one access point per channel, they beat us. They got 406 megabits per second aggregated throughput versus our 404. I'd say it's actually a wash, but technically Ubiquiti beat us there. Airtime utilization was 67%. So now we turn on the second AP. So going back to the chart here, this would be, we'll go to here, one AP operating on 100, I'm getting tongue-tied here, sorry. One AP operating on channel 100, and another distant AP also operating on channel 100 now. So first one was just the one, now we've got two. And look at what happens to our aggregated throughput. With Ubiquiti, throughput dropped to 550 megabits per second, where with the smart antenna, the aggregated throughput between these two APs is 785%. So what is causing this difference? And you'll also notice that with ours, 385 to 404, speed between each AP or bandwidth being used is equivalent, versus over here in Ubiquiti, you'll notice, one AP is getting, twice the throughput. So what's going on? Basically, it has to do with channel utilization, right? So you're using that channel 100, going back to the previous slide, and with two APs with Ubiquiti, you're using 95% of the available airtime, right? Because each device has to take turns transmitting. So now basically anytime there's a gap, you're filling up that space with data. Smart antenna does something that initially seems impossible. You've exceeded 100% of channel utilization. You're up to 131% channel utilization. And this has to do with the smart antenna. The smart antenna is essentially ignoring signals coming from the direction of the other AP that might cause interference, allowing both APs to be able to transmit data, or the users of those APs to transmit data simultaneously, at least some of the time, without causing interference and dropping the packets. So because of that, you're able to actually use more airtime than is theoretically possible. So now we do the same thing. We go up to a 3 AP, and what you see here is with Ubiquiti, which we don't have the total on there, I'm sorry. So the aggregated throughput between these APs is only 544 megabits per second. So what you've done here is you've actually decreased your performance from 2 APs at 555. Why is that? Because you're getting more interference and more drop packets, more cases of clients or APs trying to transmit at the same time and causing those packets to get dropped. And you'll see here even there on the aggregated or on the available airtime utilization, it dropped from 95 to 91%. Well, you'll notice our airtime utilization went up from 130 to 155. Overall aggregated throughput was over 900 megabits. Again, this is the smart antenna allowing devices to transmit at the same time, connecting to different APs without it interfering with their neighbors, which is something that without smart antenna you can't do. And I'm not picking on Ubiquiti. Anybody without smart antenna is going to run into these issues. The other really important thing, again, is to draw attention to here is look how evenly the data rates or the throughput has been evenly divided between those APs. Where with Ubiquiti, it's not shared evenly at all. So a user connected to this AP is getting much better throughput than a user connected to this AP, whereas here it doesn't really make a difference. So in a hotel, or again, any sort of crowded environment where there's lots of APs or lots of wireless devices in uses, smart antenna is going to make a huge difference for you. So now we'll start talking about just some basic rules of thumb for doing stuff here. So some things to talk about here is, again, your traditional ceiling mount AP is designed to cover in sort of an umbrella pattern in a circle going around the AP. Oftentimes what happens is people mount these APs on the wall, right? For whatever reason, you can't mount it in the ceiling, so you mount it in the wall. What happens now, though, is a circular signal, most of that's being shot into the floor or shot into the ceiling. It could be causing interference upstairs or downstairs, or just the signal itself is being attenuated. You don't get a lot of good coverage going out this way. So ways of solving that, smart antenna helps solve that. It can choose an antenna pattern that's better able to cover this area. Zyxel also offers a number of APs that have what we call dual optimized antenna. So instead of just having one set of antennas that are optimized for mounting on the ceiling, we've got two sets of antennas, and you can choose on a per radio basis which pattern you want to use. Do you want to use the ceiling mount pattern, or do you want to use a wall mount pattern based on where you've installed that particular access point? So again, most APs are designed to be mounted on the ceiling. You generally want them to be in as central location as possible, and you want to make them within reason as high as possible. Basically, you want to make sure that the signal going from your client device, your laptop, or your phone is going the shortest distance to the AP with the least amount of obstructions. You don't want that signal having to go through people and cubicle walls and real walls and poles to get to the access point. So generally mounting it within reason as high as possible is how you want to do it. So we make special mounting brackets that you can buy so we can mount our access points on the T-bar. So if you have a drop ceiling, where you've got those acoustic tiles and you've got these little metal bars that go across and hold them in place, those are called T-bars. You can mount those directly onto those T-bars so you don't have to drill holes. But you don't even need to do that. In general, those acoustic tiles are very, don't attenuate the signal much. So, what I like to do and suggest doing is you just put the AP, rest the AP on top of the acoustic tile where it can't be seen. So you don't have to punch any holes, you don't have to run any cables. Generally, it's going to be perfectly fine. These aren't very heavy, so they're not going to put weight on that acoustic tile. The graphic here is upside down, so you would want it pointing the same way as if you had mounted it to the walls, so you would have the Zyxel logo pointing down. And that works really well. You can also still do it on the drop ceiling if you want. Now, one thing to keep in mind is if you're mounting it on the real ceiling, not the drop ceiling, is you've probably got, HVAC ducts up there, you've got conduit ducts, you've got pipes. All of that is metal. All of that is going to wreak havoc on the Wi-Fi signal. So you don't want to mount it, in between chunks of metal that are hidden behind the drop ceiling. So don't do that. Hotel strategy, the traditional way of doing it was this umbrella coverage. You would mount the APs in a hallway, and then you would expect them to cover anywhere from 4 to 8 to 16 rooms. What's happened is most hotels that have a budget are getting away from that. And the reason is really simple. One is you have to deal with a lot of attenuation going through, bathrooms and things like that to get to the guest area. So those attenuate the signal. But the other problem is when we first started doing hospitality APs 10, 15 years ago, you had one device that needed to get on Wi-Fi. It was your laptop, right? To work, and you'd use it for email. Nowadays, though, you've probably got multiple devices. You might have your laptop for work. You might have a tablet for watching Netflix. You might have your cell phone for, keeping your emails up to date and stuff on your phone. You don't want to use your data plan. And then if you're staying with your wife, she may have her own set of devices. You've got kids. They've all got their own devices. So not only do you have to deal with weak signal in parts of the room, you have to deal with just the AP being overwhelmed, as each room may have, 3 or 4, let's just say 2 to 3 people in it. And each one of those people may have 2 to 3 devices that they want to connect. So the AP gets overwhelmed. So the new way of doing it is using lower powered access points in the room themselves. So one per room or one per every other room. So that's the most common ways of doing it now. When you're mounting an access point in a room, you want something that can be locked, or at least make it difficult, because people will steal anything that's not locked down in a room, in a hotel room, when they check out. And you should have the ability to turn off the LEDs, because no one wants to sleep with the flashing, green light above their head. So make sure you've got the LEDs turned off. We've got a question here from Corey. So does it make a difference on the orientation of the AP? So yes, it absolutely does. So that's where that slide, a couple slides back, where we were talking about mounting at a wall. It makes a huge difference because the antenna pattern is optimized to be mounted on a ceiling and then go out in an umbrella pattern. So if you mount it on a upside down, it's going to be sending the bulk of the signal up to the ceiling where you don't want it. Or if you mount it on the wall, it's going to be sending a big chunk of the signal up into the ceiling and down into the floor instead of where the users are. So absolutely makes a big difference. So if you're not mounting them correctly, smart antenna helps with that, or look at something that's got dual optimized antenna where you can switch the antenna pattern based on the installation location. Okay, going forward here. So public areas. Generally, the most important thing to take into mind here is user density. Are you going to have a lot of users in this area that want to connect? So that will determine how many APs you need. So obviously something like a convention center, meeting rooms, you probably want to factor in more users in, in a general wide open lobby where there's probably just a couple people waiting for their rides or whatnot hanging out. Generally though, you're going to provide coverage based on the individual area. So the lobby coverage and access points should be a different set of access points than the hotel bar, which should be different than the pool, for instance. In the areas where you've got a lot of access points, smart antenna is going to make a huge difference for you. So in schools, the questions really come down to how many students are going to be per room, and do those students need to be connected to the Wi-Fi? So in a lot of rooms, the Wi-Fi is there, but they're not heavily using it. In other rooms, you have these smart classrooms where the teacher, where every student may have a Chromebook or tablet that's connected, and the teacher may be pushing out screen shares or streaming video from her device to each of those clients. So that's going to make a big difference, right? So if you're pushing out video to every single student in the room, you're going to need higher speed and higher density than if it's just a few people connecting, or if they're only connecting to the web when they're doing research and browsing Wikipedia. So generally, for a class up to up to around 20 students, we suggest 2 access points per room. Whether you're using our cloud managed stuff or our controller managed stuff, we have a special algorithm designed just for smart classrooms to be able to easily load share with 30 users or 20 users all connecting simultaneously. If you're going to have 30 or more students per classroom, you absolutely must have smart antenna. It's going to make a huge difference for you. So same number of APs, but a lot more students with smart antenna. And just in general, keep in mind teachers and students should be VLAN'd off from each other. They should not be connecting and being able to reach each other's devices. So now we'll talk a little bit about 802.11ax, aka Wi-Fi 6. So something interesting here, we'll go through some of this, is Wi-Fi 6 is in a lot of ways completely rewriting how 802.11 Wi-Fi works. We've gone back, looked at a lot of those problems that we've talked about before, and we've tried to solve it by changing the technology. So Wi-Fi 6 works in both 2.4 and 5 gigahertz and any other frequencies that open up. Unlike 802.11ac, which was only on the 5 gigahertz radio. It's specifically been designed to handle high density environments. So basically with the same data rate, you can get up to 2 times the actual measured throughput with the same physical rate. And there's all sorts of neat stuff we've done to try to minimize interference and to make it easier to share spectrum between devices. So some of the key things here they've done, 1024 QAM, which we've talked about earlier, OFDMA. So OFDMA allows the access point to coordinate and designate airtime to individual clients. So this gets rid of that problem with multiple devices deciding to transmit at the same time. It gets rid of the hidden node problem, makes a huge difference for us there. We add in upstream MIMO, so multiple clients can transmit at the same time back to the client. We have spatial frequency reuse. We have something out there called BSS color coding. What is it called? TMSS, TMMS, a bunch of other stuff. It's really cool that you can do with Wi-Fi 6. So the Wi-Fi Alliance themselves just got around to starting to certify Wi-Fi 6 devices. The IEEE working group, last time I checked, they still weren't expected to ratify the actual standard until September of 2020. So everything that's out there now is based on the draft spec, not the final spec. It's really important. We'll wait till I get to the next slide. I'll go into it here. But for some of the first generation, the first 1.1, 1.2 chipsets, they don't support a number of those features, and they never will. So I'm going to give this example here. There's two main chipsets here when it comes to Wi-Fi 6, Qualcomm and Broadcom. Both Qualcomm and Broadcom are roughly the same. This is based on Qualcomm. Again, Broadcom is pretty much the same here. So what you see is these first generation Wi-Fi 6 chips don't support upstream OFDMA. They don't support upstream MIMO. They don't support TWT or BSS color coding. These are all really important aspects of Wi-Fi 6 that the Gen 1 chipsets do not support and can never be upgraded to supporting. The Gen 2 chipsets should be able to support everything that's in the Wi-Fi 6 spec. They should be able to support everything once the final version is ratified, just with a firmware update. So we may not support all of these features today, but Gen 2 chips will be upgradable to support these features. Gen 1 will not. And unfortunately, no one advertises which generation of chip they're using. A good rule of thumb is any Wi-Fi 6 product that was shipping before, say, September of this year, so anything that launched in August or earlier of this year, or of 2019, is Gen 1. Anything that launched in the fall, maybe Gen 1, maybe Gen 2, depending on the individual product. And there's no easy way to find it other than looking at the FCC docs, finding out the chipset, and then Googling that chipset to see which generation it is. So for us, everything that Zyxel is launching, including our current Wi-Fi 6 AP, is based on the Gen 2 chip. So we may not support all these features today. We're still waiting on Qualcomm to provide the code to support all of these, but they will be feature upgradable to support everything that's part of Wi-Fi 6. So that is it. That concludes today's presentation. If you have any questions, send them into the Q&A window. Just to let you guys know, we do have forums. If you're not using them, you can go to forum.zyxel.com. Unlike some of the other user forums that are out there from our competition, our R&D team in Taiwan does read those forums and does pitch in with answers a lot of times. So if you ask a question or you have some feedback or suggestions on the hardware or the interface, it is being seen by our team in Taiwan at our headquarters when you post to the forum. And my email's down here at the bottom. If you want to reach out to me personally about something, you can do that there. Okay, so John is asking here, how about mesh? Assuming I have Ethernet wires available, is mesh with wired backhaul any better than APs? So the answer to that is, we do support mesh, both on our Nebula and controller stuff. Mesh is okay, but no, it's not as good as having everything Ethernet hardwired. So again, when you're using a mesh type device, you've got a number of access points that have no Ethernet connection, and so they're having to make wireless connections to each other until they can reach an access point that does have a wired connection. So you have to think here, every time you send data, has a hop on that mesh, you're having to basically send the data again, right? And because each client device, each wireless device has to take turns transmitting, you're severely degrading the performance of that network with each hop. So with each hop, you're essentially, having the available bandwidth because it's having to send the data once from the client device to the AP, from that AP to the next AP in the mesh, then from that AP to the next AP. So it's all having to take turns. So it's having to eat up your available airtime as it relays that data from access point to access point back to the mesh. So just keep that in mind. Every hop essentially halves the available throughput that you're going to be able to achieve. So that's why, you might remember Ruckus when he first, really broke into the market. That was their big thing, mesh, mesh, mesh. And now they don't mesh, mesh, mesh anymore because in reality, if you have no other option, it works okay. But you don't want that to be your primary connection status for most of your access points. Thanks, Dave. Appreciate the feedback. Thank you, Corey. Again, any other questions, you can send them in the Q&A or my email is there on the screen. You can email me directly. You can always post to our forum. And just going back to the mesh thing, I should also point out on the consumer side of things, there is a new technology out there called Easy Mesh, which is for consumer devices. It's part of the Wi-Fi certification, so you might see that if you go to the Wi-Fi Alliance website. Right now, almost nobody supports it. It's supposed to allow mesh to work between different vendors and different chipsets. It's coming, but it's taking a long time. I know Qualcomm doesn't support it properly yet. I don't think Broadcom does. If you go check the list of certified devices, there's like 4. I think there's 3 D-Link products and 1 TP-Link product that currently support it. But I expect to see Easy Mesh supported by more devices once the chipset vendors get their software up to date. But don't get confused. It's going to be different than the business class mesh, and you're not going to want consumer grade mesh used in a business environment just for security reasons. We got a question here from Paul. He's asking if Unicode characters can be used in our SSIDs. And the answer to that is, I don't know. I want to say we do now support it. I know we didn't a few years ago. I think it's supported now, but I don't know it for sure. You can send me an email asking that, and I can look into it for you and get you the answer. But I don't know for sure. I think the answer is yes, but I'm not 100% on that. Okay, thanks, guys. I don't have any more questions, so I'm going to go ahead and end today's presentation. If you're typing something up, go ahead and highlight it real quick and copy it. Just email it to me and I'll answer you, or you can give me a call here at the office. And again, we're always looking for feedback from you guys. What did you like? What did you not like about today's presentation? How could we make it better? What other topics and things would you like to see us talk about? As part of our partner programs, part of our partners, we want to make sure that these webinars we do are valuable for you and your employees, but we need your feedback as to what you're looking for and what would make your life easier or what you'd like to learn a little bit more about. So go ahead and either email me directly or just reach out to your salesperson and tell them and they can convey it to me. Thanks, guys.